This podcast is brought to you by Top, the stories of top companies. Disclaimer: this AI-generated content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. If you like our podcasts, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And don't forget to follow us on X at Top. Find thousands of stories of top companies on our website, Top. Top is brought to you by HeyFin.co. Fin is a personalized junior AI research assistant for equity portfolio managers. Check it out at HeyFin.co. Sealed Air Corporation, the unexpected journey from bubble wrap to packaging platform. Pop a sheet of bubble wrap and you have performed a small act of communion with one of the most unusual companies in American industrial history. Sealed Air Corporation, the business behind that satisfying snap, has generated roughly $5.5 billion in annual revenue, survived a near-death leveraged recapitalization, executed one of the most regretted acquisitions of the 2010s, cycled through 5 CEOs in under a decade, and now stands at the threshold of going private in a $10 billion buyout by Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice. For a company most people associate with packing peanuts and popping bubbles, that is quite a ride. The story of Sealed Air is really 3 stories braided together. The first is an innovation tale. 2 engineers trying to make textured wallpaper accidentally invent a product that will protect billions of dollars of fragile goods and become a cultural icon. The second is a cautionary tale about financial engineering, from the famous 1989 leveraged recapitalization that became a Harvard Business School case study to the disastrous Diversey acquisition that added $4 billion of debt for a business that never belonged in the portfolio. The third is a transformation tale, a company repeatedly forced to reinvent itself as patents expire, markets mature, activists circle, and the world demands less plastic. What makes Sealed Air fascinating is not any single chapter, but the pattern that connects them all. The relentless tension between innovation and commoditization, between building moats and watching them erode, between bold bets and their unintended consequences. The company has been brilliant and reckless, disciplined and distracted, often within the same decade. For investors, the Sealed Air story illuminates questions that apply far beyond packaging. How do you sustain competitive advantage when your core product's patents expire? When does financial engineering strengthen a business, and when does it cripple one? What happens when a conglomerate premium turns into a conglomerate discount? And what do you do when the activists show up and you realize they might be right? The company that Mark Chavan and Al Fielding founded with $85,000 in 1960 is about to be taken private for over $10 billion. Here is how that happened. The year was 1957. In a garage in Hawthorne, New Jersey, a Swiss chemical engineer named Mark Chavan and an American mechanical engineer named Alfred Fielding were trying to make wallpaper cool again. Their idea was elegant in theory. Seal 2 sheets of plastic together to create a textured, 3-dimensional surface that would make any wall feel modern and luxurious. They fed 2 shower curtains through a heat sealing machine and watched as a matrix of tiny air pockets formed between the layers. The result was visually interesting, but, as a wall covering, completely impractical. Nobody wanted bumpy, air-filled walls. The wallpaper market gave them a polite no. This is one of those founding stories that sounds apocryphal, but is actually well documented. Chavan, who had studied chemistry in Switzerland and brought a European inventor's sensibility to practical problems, and Fielding, who had the mechanical engineering chops to build production equipment from scratch, were a classic inventor partnership. One man with the vision, the other with the tools to make it real. They had staked their reputations and personal savings on an idea that the market had just rejected. What they did next would determine whether they became a footnote or a fortune. Chavan and Fielding did not give up on the material itself. If it could not decorate a wall, perhaps it could insulate a greenhouse. The trapped air bubbles, after all, provided decent thermal insulation. They pivoted to agricultural applications, pitching their creation to greenhouse operators who needed affordable insulation for glass structures. The results were underwhelming. The material degraded too quickly under UV exposure and could not compete with established insulation products on performance or price. 2 pivots in, and they still had not found a market. Most inventors would have quit. The wallpaper application had failed. The greenhouse application had failed. They were running out of money and running out of ideas. But Siobhan and Fielding had one advantage that many inventors lack. They were not attached to a specific application. They were attached to the material itself. They believed the trapped air structure had value. They just had not found the right customer yet. The breakthrough came from an unlikely direction. Someone at IBM was looking for a better way to ship the company's new 1401 computer, a room-sized mainframe that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and was exquisitely sensitive to vibration and impact. Traditional packing materials, primarily wadded paper and Excelsior, were inconsistent and often inadequate for protecting high-value electronics. The air-cushioned plastic material that Siobhan and Fielding had invented turned out to be nearly perfect for the job. Lightweight, conformable, shock-absorbing, and clean. IBM became the first major customer, and the endorsement transformed bubble wrap from a failed wallpaper experiment into a legitimate industrial product. In 1960, Siobhan and Fielding formally incorporated Sealed Air Corporation, raising $85,000 in an initial public offering, an amount that would be roughly $900,000 in today's money. It was an unusually early IPO for such a tiny company, but it gave them the capital to begin scaling production and building a sales force. The IBM relationship provided credibility with other electronics manufacturers and shippers of fragile goods. Throughout the 1960s, Sealed Air methodically expanded its customer base, targeting industries where the cost of product damage during shipping exceeded the cost of premium packaging materials. What Siobhan and Fielding understood intuitively, and what would define Sealed Air's strategy for decades, was that they were not really selling plastic. They were selling insurance against breakage. The value proposition was not the material itself, but the protection it provided, and the economic calculus was simple. If your product was worth $1,000 and traditional packaging gave you a 5% breakage rate, spending an extra dollar per unit on bubble wrap to cut that rate to near zero was an obvious trade. This insight, selling outcomes rather than inputs, would become the company's enduring strategic principle. The 1960s and early 1970s also saw the beginning of geographic expansion. Sealed Air established its first overseas operations in Western Europe, recognizing that the same shipping problems that plagued American manufacturers existed everywhere goods moved. The logic was straightforward. Protective packaging is a universal need. Whether you are shipping Volkswagen parts from Wolfsburg, Sony electronics from Tokyo, or Caterpillar equipment from Peoria, the physics of transit damage are the same. A company that could serve manufacturers globally with local production and technical support would have an enormous advantage over regional competitors limited to single markets. By the late 1970s, Sealed Air had entered the Far East, and foreign sales accounted for nearly a quarter of total revenues. By 1979, annual sales exceeded $70 million, a remarkable trajectory for a product that had started life as a wallpaper reject. The company had also begun to develop something that would prove more valuable than any single product: an engineering-led corporate culture. Sealed Air hired people who understood material science, manufacturing processes, and customer applications. It was not a sales-driven organization pushing commodity products through distribution channels. It was a technical organization that embedded its engineers in customer facilities, studied their shipping problems firsthand, and designed solutions that competitors could not easily replicate. This culture, quiet and unglamorous by Silicon Valley standards, would become the foundation of the company's competitive moat. But the most consequential development of this era was not about protective packaging at all. In 1998, Sealed Air would complete the acquisition of the cryovac packaging business from W.R. Grace & Company, adding food packaging to its portfolio and fundamentally transforming the company's scale and strategic profile. That deal, a $4.9 billion transaction that brought with it both enormous opportunity and a decade-long asbestos liability headache, would reshape Sealed Air into a genuinely diversified packaging enterprise. but that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what mattered was that Siobhan and Fielding had created something remarkable, a product category where none had existed before, anchored by a brand that would become one of the most recognizable in the industrial world. By the mid-1970s, Sealed Air had moved well beyond its garage invention origins. The company held a critical competitive advantage that most observers underappreciated: a patented process for embossing and laminating plastic sheets to produce consistent, uniform air bubbles. This was not just a product patent, but a manufacturing process patent, and it created a genuine barrier to imitation. Competitors could see the finished product and understand the concept, but replicating the precise, high-speed production process that delivered reliable, uniform cushioning at scale was far more difficult than it appeared. Under the leadership of T.J. Dermot Dunphy, who became CEO in 1971 and would hold the role for nearly 3 decades, Sealed Air pursued a strategy of relentless vertical integration and geographic expansion. The company acquired Smith Packaging Limited in Canada in 1970, establishing its first North American footprint outside the United States. European operations expanded through the decade, and the company built a network of manufacturing facilities that allowed it to serve customers locally rather than shipping lightweight but bulky packaging materials across oceans. The 1980s brought the first serious test of Sealed Air's moat: patent expiration. When the original bubble wrap patents expired, competitors rushed in, offering lower-priced alternatives that replicated the basic air cushion concept. This is a defining moment in any technology company's life cycle, the moment when the legal protection that enabled premium pricing disappears, and the market discovers whether you have built real competitive advantages or merely enjoyed a temporary monopoly. Think of pharmaceutical companies facing generic competition, or consumer electronics brands watching their innovations become features in cheaper products. The patent cliff is where strategy meets reality. Many businesses, faced with this challenge, simply accept commoditization and compete on price. Dunphy took a different approach. He moved Sealed Air upmarket, investing in new proprietary products that extended the company's technology lead. Foam-in-place technology emerged as a critical next-generation product. Rather than using pre-formed cushioning materials, foam-in-place systems dispensed liquid chemicals directly into a shipping container, where they expanded and hardened around the product, creating a custom-fitted protective mold. Imagine opening a box and finding your item nestled in a rigid foam cradle that perfectly conforms to its shape, that is, foam in place. And in its early years, the technology had virtually no competition. This gave Sealed Air another window of patent-protected pricing power. The company also acquired Jiffy Packaging Corporation in 1987, solidifying its dominant position in the protective mailer market, the padded envelopes that remain ubiquitous in shipping today. What Dunphy built during this era was not a single product company, but a packaging solutions platform. The sales approach evolved from selling materials to selling systems, consultative relationships where Sealed Air engineers worked alongside customers to design optimal packaging solutions for specific products. This relationship-driven sales model created switching costs that pure material suppliers could not replicate. When your packaging engineer has spent months optimizing the cushioning system for your most fragile product line, you do not switch suppliers to save a few cents per unit. The food packaging revolution was also reshaping the broader industry context during this period. Vacuum packaging technology, which Cryovac had pioneered under W.R. Grace's ownership, was transforming the grocery and meat industries. By removing oxygen from the packaging environment, vacuum-sealed bags dramatically extended the shelf life of fresh proteins, reducing spoilage and waste while enabling longer-distance distribution. The technology was moving from specialty applications to mainstream adoption, creating a massive addressable market that Sealed Air would eventually enter through the 1998 Cryovac merger. But even before that deal, the food packaging trend influenced Sealed Air's thinking about its future. The company needed growth beyond protective packaging, and food preservation represented a market with similar technical complexity, similar customer relationships, and similar opportunities for premium pricing. The geographic footprint grew into a genuine global manufacturing and distribution network. By the late 1990s, Sealed Air operated facilities on every major continent, with local manufacturing allowing the company to serve customers with short lead times while avoiding the economics-killing cost of shipping air across oceans. Packaging materials are, by definition, mostly air, and shipping air is economically irrational. A roll of bubble wrap takes up the same truck space whether it is full-priced or discounted, which means freight costs as a percentage of revenue can be punishing for long-distance shipments. Local manufacturing eliminates this problem and provides the responsiveness that just-in-time manufacturing customers demand. This distributed manufacturing network would prove to be a durable competitive advantage, particularly as global supply chains became more complex and customers valued reliability and proximity. By the time Sealed Air completed the transformative Cryovac merger in 1998, it had built a business with genuine structural advantages: manufacturing scale, a global distribution network, deep customer relationships, proprietary technology across multiple product lines, and a brand that commanded premium pricing. The question was whether those advantages were sufficient to justify the ambitions that came next, because what followed the Cryovac deal was a period of financial engineering and strategic overreach that would test the company's resilience to its limits. On May 11, 1989, Sealed Air did something that most public companies would consider corporate suicide. With only 8.25 million shares outstanding, the company paid a special cash dividend of $40 per share, totaling $330 million, financed almost entirely with $307 million in new debt. Overnight, Sealed Air's debt-to-equity ratio leapt from 13% to 136%. The company had negative net worth. On paper, it was insolvent. This was not an act of desperation, it was deliberate. CEO Dermot Dunphy, drawing on the theories of Harvard economist Michael Jensen about the disciplinary benefits of debt, had decided to manufacture a crisis. His reasoning was counterintuitive but internally logical. Sealed Air had become too comfortable. The company generated strong free cash flow with limited competitive pressure, and Dunphy believed this comfort was breeding complacency. Managers had no urgency to improve operations because there was no existential threat. By loading the company with debt that had to be serviced, Dunphy forced every employee to understand that survival now depended on genuine operational improvement, not incremental optimization. The recapitalization became a famous Harvard Business School case study, written by Karen Ruck, because, against all conventional wisdom, it worked. Sealed Air dramatically improved manufacturing efficiency, rationalized its capital budgeting process, redesigned compensation systems to align with cash flow generation, and paid down the debt well ahead of schedule. The leveraged recap demonstrated that, under certain conditions, voluntary financial constraint could function as an organizational catalyst, shaking loose the inertia that accumulates inside successful companies. But the lesson that corporate America drew from Sealed Air's 1989 experiment was more dangerous than the experiment itself. The takeaway for many executives became, leverage is a tool for unlocking value. That narrative would echo through the late 1990s and 2000s in ways that Dunphy might not have anticipated. 9 years later, in March 1998, Sealed Air completed the largest deal in its history, the merger with the Cryovac packaging business of W.R. Grace & Company in a transaction valued at $4.9 billion. Cryovac was a jewel, a global leader in vacuum packaging technology that had revolutionized the way meat, poultry, and seafood were processed and shipped. The brand dated to 1941, when it was developed to protect food for Allied soldiers during World War II, keeping rations fresh across oceanic supply lines that stretched for thousands of miles. By the 1990s, Cryovac's shrink bags, vacuum-sealed trays, and case-ready packaging systems were essential infrastructure for the global protein supply chain. To understand why Cryovac was so valuable, consider the economics of meat processing. A typical beef processor handles thousands of carcasses per day, each worth hundreds of dollars, and every day of additional shelf life represents real economic value. Less spoilage, wider geographic distribution, and more flexibility in the supply chain between processor and retailer. Cryovac's vacuum packaging technology could extend the shelf life of fresh beef from a few days to several weeks, a transformative capability that changed how the entire industry operated. Case-ready packaging, which allowed processors to package individual cuts at the processing plant rather than shipping whole carcasses to be cut at the grocery store, was another Cryovac innovation that streamlined the supply chain and reduced waste. These were not incremental improvements. They were fundamental transformations of how the protein industry worked. The deal structure was extraordinarily complex, designed to achieve tax efficiency while shielding Sealed Air from W.R. Grace's mounting asbestos liabilities. Grace transferred the Cryovac business to Sealed Air in return for $1.26 billion distributed to Grace's other subsidiaries, which were spun off as a separate company retaining the Grace name. Former Grace shareholders received approximately 63% of the newly combined company's stock. As part of the post-merger restructuring, Sealed Air eliminated roughly 750 jobs from an enlarged workforce of 14,500 and took $111 million in restructuring charges. Despite the legal firewall built into the transaction, the asbestos liabilities followed. Starting in 2000, Sealed Air was named in lawsuits, alleging the Cryovac transaction constituted a fraudulent transfer designed to escape asbestos obligations. The legal theory was that W.R. Grace had shed its most valuable asset, Cryovac, precisely to avoid paying the asbestos claims against its other businesses. The company eventually settled, but not until 2014, when it made a final payment of $930 million in cash, plus 18 million shares of its own stock. The total cost, including interest that had accrued during Grace's bankruptcy proceedings, was staggering. The original settlement in 2002 had called for $512.5 million, plus annual interest of 5.5%. But the compounding of that interest over the decade it took to resolve Grace's bankruptcy inflated the final bill dramatically. The asbestos saga consumed over a decade of management attention, hundreds of millions in legal costs, and nearly $1 billion in settlement payments. A reminder that financial engineering can create liabilities as easily as it creates value. The combination of post-Cryovac integration, asbestos litigation, and the continuing need to service debt from various transactions left Sealed Air stretched but fundamentally viable entering the 2000s. The Cryovac business proved its strategic worth. Food packaging provided stability and recurring revenue that protective packaging, with its greater cyclicality, could not match on its own. Then came 2008. The financial crisis hit Sealed Air on multiple fronts. Gross profit margins compressed as petrochemical-based raw material costs peaked in the third quarter. North American and Latin American volumes declined as industrial production contracted sharply, and the company absorbed a self-inflicted wound from a poorly timed SAP enterprise software launch in July 2008 that caused distributors to pre-buy heavily in the second quarter and pull back sharply afterward. Latin American volumes suffered from Brazilian beef export restrictions that reduced demand for Cryovac food packaging. The company also took a $13.7 million charge for impairment of auction-rate securities, a financial instrument that froze during the credit crisis, a reminder that even industrial companies can get caught up in financial market dislocations. The crisis exposed a fundamental truth about Sealed Air's business model that would shape strategy for the next decade. The two main business lines had very different cyclical profiles. Food packaging, anchored by Cryovac, proved relatively resilient because food consumption is one of the most defensive categories in the economy. People reduce their restaurant spending during recessions, but they still buy groceries, and groceries still need packaging. Protective packaging, by contrast, tracked industrial production and consumer spending much more closely, making it significantly more cyclical. This divergence would eventually become one of the arguments for separating the two businesses. Sealed Air survived the crisis without a liquidity emergency, but the company emerged from 2008 diminished, with elevated debt, constrained investment capacity, and growing questions from shareholders about whether management had a credible plan for the next chapter. CEO William Hickey, who had succeeded Dunphy in 2000, was under pressure to demonstrate a growth strategy that could reignite the stock. Those questions would lead to one of the most regrettable acquisitions in recent packaging industry history. In June 2011, Sealed Air's board and CEO William Hickey made a bet that would haunt the company for the next 6 years. They announced the acquisition of Diversey Holdings, a global institutional cleaning and hygiene chemicals company, from Clayton, Dubilier and Rice and Unilever for $4.3 billion. The deal closed in October 2011. To understand why this happened, you need to understand the mindset inside Sealed Air at the time. The company was still carrying debt from the Cryovac transaction and the asbestos settlement. The protective packaging business, while profitable, was maturing. Bubble wrap patents had long expired. The food packaging business was strong but growing in the low single digits. Management was searching for a growth engine, and Diversey, with its $40 billion addressable market in cleaning and sanitization, its presence in 60-plus countries, and its exposure to secular trends in food safety and institutional hygiene, looked like the answer. Hickey framed the rationale around 3 megatrends: food safety and food security, health and hygiene, and emerging market growth. Diversey operated in hotels, hospitals, food processing plants, and commercial laundries worldwide, with a presence in more than 60 countries. The pitch was that combining Sealed Air's food packaging expertise with Diversey's hygiene and cleaning solutions would create a comprehensive platform for food safety from farm to fork. Cross-selling opportunities, shared distribution networks, and combined sustainability initiatives would generate synergies that neither company could achieve alone. It was the kind of strategic narrative that works beautifully in a PowerPoint presentation and falls apart on the factory floor. The market was skeptical from the start. Diversey's shareholders received $2.1 billion in cash plus 31.7 million shares of Sealed Air common stock, bringing the total equity and cash consideration to approximately $2.6 billion, with additional assumed debt pushing the total enterprise value to $4.3 billion. The deal added enormous debt to an already leveraged balance sheet. More fundamentally, the strategic logic was thin. Diversey sold cleaning chemicals and dispensing equipment to janitorial staff in hotels and hospitals. Sealed Air sold packaging materials and systems to food processors and e-commerce fulfillment centers. The customer sets barely overlapped. The economics were different. The sales motions were different. The cultures were different. Integration proved exactly as difficult as skeptics predicted. Diversey's business model centered on dispensing systems installed at customer sites, with revenue generated through chemical refills and service contracts. While this recurring revenue model was attractive in theory, it operated at lower margins than Sealed Air's core packaging businesses and required fundamentally different operational and sales capabilities. The promised synergies in sustainability, cross-selling, and shared distribution were largely aspirational. In practice, hotel housekeepers and meat processing plant managers occupied different worlds and bought from different ecosystems. The financial burden was immediate and severe. Sealed Air's total debt load ballooned, constraining the company's ability to invest in its core packaging businesses at precisely the moment when e-commerce was beginning to transform protective packaging demand. While Amazon was building its empire and creating explosive growth in the demand for void fill, cushioning, and automated packaging, Sealed Air was distracted by the challenge of integrating a cleaning chemicals company. The activist community took notice. Shareholder pressure mounted as investors questioned why a packaging company had bought a cleaning chemicals business at a premium valuation financed with debt. The board found itself defending a strategic rationale that looked thinner with every quarterly earnings call. Diversey's revenue, approximately $2.6 billion annually, was substantial enough to matter, but insufficiently profitable to justify the capital invested. William Hickey, who had been CEO since 2000 and had championed the Diversey deal, found himself increasingly isolated. Within 18 months of the acquisition's closing, he announced his retirement, effective March 2013. The board brought in Jerome Parabere, a 35-year veteran of Dow Chemical, who had led the integration of the massive Rohm and Haas acquisition, as president and COO in September 2012, with a predetermined transition to CEO. The search for Hickey's successor was, in retrospect, an acknowledgement that the Diversey acquisition had been a strategic error of the first order. The question now was how long it would take to unwind it, and whether the new CEO would have the courage to admit the mistake publicly and take the write-down. Jerome Parabère arrived at Sealed Air in the fall of 2012, with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his career making large, complex industrial organizations work. A graduate of Sciences Po in Paris, he had spent 35 years at Dow Chemical, rising through a series of global leadership positions to run Dow Advanced Materials. His defining experience was leading the integration of Rome and Haas, a $20 billion deal that had to be executed during the depths of the 2008 financial crisis. If anyone understood how to rationalize a bloated industrial portfolio under financial pressure, it was Parabère. When he became CEO on March 1, 2013, the diagnosis was clear. Sealed Air was trying to be too many things to too many customers. Diversey was dragging down margins, consuming management bandwidth, and obscuring the value of the core packaging businesses. The balance sheet was over-leveraged. The organization needed focus. Parabère was not a packaging industry insider, and that was precisely the point. He brought the perspective of someone who had seen what worked and what did not in large-scale industrial transformations. At Dow Chemical, he had learned that complexity is the enemy of performance, and that the hardest decisions in business are not about what to do, but about what to stop doing. Parabère declared that Sealed Air needed to reinvent itself and launched a company-wide transformation program centered on operational excellence and portfolio rationalization. He drove EBITDA margins back toward 15% through systematic cost reduction and operational rigor. He reframed Sealed Air's identity from a manufacturer of packaging materials to a knowledge-based company that sold solutions rather than commodities. Most importantly, he made it clear internally and externally that Diversey did not belong in the portfolio. The execution took time. Parabère needed to stabilize the business, improve Diversey's standalone performance to make it attractive to buyers, and prepare the organizational infrastructure for separation. He restructured the organization, eliminated redundant positions, renegotiated supplier contracts, and invested selectively in the product lines with the highest margin potential. He also had to manage the continuing asbestos liability payments from the Cryovac transaction, which were not fully resolved until 2014, when Sealed Air made its final settlement payment. The simultaneous demands of operational transformation, portfolio rationalization, and legacy liability resolution made Parabère's tenure one of the most challenging CEO assignments in the packaging industry. By 2017, he was ready. On March 27, 2017, Sealed Air announced the sale of its Diversey Care division, plus the food hygiene and cleaning business within its food care segment, to Bain Capital Private Equity for approximately $3.2 billion. The transaction closed on September 6, 2017. The divested business had generated approximately $2.6 billion in net sales in 2016 and employed roughly 8,600 people globally. The math was painful. Sealed Air had paid $4.3 billion for Diversey in 2011 and sold the combined cleaning businesses for $3.2 billion 6 years later. That represents an explicit $1.1 billion value destruction on the transaction itself, before accounting for integration costs, debt service on deal-related borrowings, opportunity costs, and 6 years of management distraction. By any measure, the Diversey acquisition was among the most value-destructive deals in the packaging industry's recent history. It stands as a cautionary tale about the seductive appeal of strategic diversification when the underlying businesses have no genuine operational connection. But the divestiture was the right move. Sealed Air used the proceeds to pay down debt, bringing net leverage to the 3.5 to 4 times range, and to repurchase shares. The stock responded positively, as investors appreciated both the strategic clarity and the improved balance sheet. The company that emerged was leaner, more focused, and better positioned to capitalize on the secular trends reshaping its core markets. E-commerce growth driving demand for protective packaging, protein industry expansion driving demand for Cryovac food packaging, and automation adoption driving demand for integrated packaging systems. The strategic repositioning accelerated under Parabear's successor, Ted Doheny, an industrial executive who described himself as an entrepreneur trapped in a big company who grew up selling fruits and vegetables, became CEO in January 2018. Where Parabear had been the disciplined surgeon, cutting costs and divesting the unhealthy tissue, Doheny styled himself as a builder. He brought a different energy to the organization, launching a transformation program he branded Reinvent C with 4 pillars: process, products, people, and performance. He shifted management metrics toward return on invested capital and pushed the organization to think of itself as a technology and automation company rather than a materials manufacturer. The Reinvent C program was ambitious in scope. Doheny established common, world-class operational processes across all functions, benchmarked against best-in-class industrial companies. He pushed for reinvention of core products, particularly in areas where patent protection had long since expired, and the company was competing on price rather than innovation. He drove cultural change, replacing what he saw as a complacent mindset with one oriented towards speed and customer centricity. And he reoriented the entire performance management system around return on invested capital, a metric that forces managers to think about not just how much profit they generate, but how much capital they consume to generate it. Doheny's most significant strategic move was the 2019 acquisition of Automated Packaging Systems for $510 million. This deal brought the Autobag brand, a market leader in automated bagging systems, into the Sealed Air portfolio and dramatically accelerated the company's shift toward the equipment plus consumables business model. Instead of simply selling rolls of film and bags, Sealed Air could now place sophisticated packaging equipment at customer sites and earn recurring revenue from the proprietary consumables those machines required. In 2021, Doheny rebranded the company as C, emphasizing automation, digital packaging, and sustainability. The rebranding was polarizing, with some investors viewing it as substance and others as corporate theater. Changing a company's name does not change its competitive position, but it can signal a genuine shift in strategic identity, and in this case, the underlying shift was real. The Reinvent C program generated approximately $355 million in cumulative savings against an original target of $250 million, demonstrating genuine operational improvement. That the company exceeded its savings target by more than 40% suggested that Doheny's operational discipline was real, even if his branding instincts were debatable. The sustainability push also took tangible form during this period. In October 2018, Sealed Air had announced its 2025 Sustainability and Plastics Pledge, committing to make 100% of its packaging solutions recyclable or reusable by 2025, and to achieve an average of 50% recycled content across all packaging. These were ambitious targets that reflected both genuine environmental concern and a strategic recognition that sustainability was becoming a purchasing criterion for major customers. The company invested in Plastic Energy, a chemical recycling specialist, and developed closed-loop foam return programs. By 2020, the transformation was showing results. Margins had improved, the stock had rebounded from its post-Diversey lows, and the company was positioned as a more focused, technologically sophisticated packaging solutions provider. But growth remained elusive in what were fundamentally mature markets, and the question of whether the company's two main businesses, protective and food packaging, were truly better together remained unanswered. When COVID-19 shut down the global economy in March 2020, the packaging industry experienced something unusual: extreme divergence within a single sector. Restaurants closed, devastating food service packaging demand. Grocery stores experienced panic buying, surging food retail packaging demand. And e-commerce, already growing rapidly, went vertical as consumers shifted virtually all discretionary shopping online. For Sealed Air, the pandemic was a mixed but ultimately favorable force. The protective packaging business, anchored by bubble wrap, Autobag automated systems, and void fill materials benefited enormously from the e-commerce explosion. Amazon alone was opening new fulfillment centers at a rate of roughly one every 3 days during the peak pandemic expansion, and each of those facilities needed packaging materials and equipment. Ted Doheny, with characteristic marketing instinct, coined the phrase touchless environments to describe the pandemic-driven demand for automated packaging systems that reduced human contact with products. It was part branding, part genuine insight. Labor shortages in warehouses were making automated packaging not just preferable, but necessary. When you cannot hire enough workers to manually pack boxes, machines that can run 24 hours a day with minimal supervision become essential infrastructure rather than optional upgrades. The food packaging business, built around the Cryovac brand, experienced its own pandemic dynamic. While food service channels contracted sharply as restaurants shuttered, food retail channels surged as consumers cooked at home. Cryovac's strength in protein packaging, vacuum-sealed meats, poultry, and seafood for grocery retail, provided a natural hedge. By the first quarter of 2021, net sales were increasing 8% year-over-year, with strength across e-commerce, food retail, and equipment sales. Doheny used the pandemic tailwind to push forward with strategic acquisitions. The most significant was the purchase of Liquibox, a pioneer in bag-and-box sustainable fluids and liquids packaging, from Olympus Partners. The deal closed on January 31, 2023, for $1.15 billion. Liquibox served fresh food, beverage, consumer goods, and industrial end markets with dispensing solutions, essentially the liquid equivalent of Sealed Air's approach to solid product packaging. The strategic logic was to accelerate growth in what management identified as the fastest-growing segment of the Cryovac portfolio, fluids and liquids packaging. The pandemic period also validated one of Sealed Air's often overlooked strategic advantages, its distributed global manufacturing footprint. While competitors with centralized production facilities struggled with supply chain disruptions, Sealed Air's network of local manufacturing plants across major markets provided resilience. The nearshoring trend that accelerated during COVID, as companies sought to reduce dependence on long supply chains, played directly to Sealed Air's strength. Customers who had previously sourced packaging from distant low-cost producers discovered the value of having a supplier that could deliver from a plant 30 miles away rather than 3,000 miles away. But the pandemic also masked underlying challenges. Revenue peaked in 2022, and the post-COVID normalization proved more painful than expected. The e-commerce boom decelerated as consumers returned to physical stores. Industrial customers who had built up safety stock during supply chain disruptions began aggressively destocking, a phenomenon that hit protective packaging particularly hard because distributors had overordered during the supply chain crisis and now needed months to work through excess inventory. Protective segment net sales fell 19% year-over-year in the fourth quarter of 2022, with organic volumes down 20%. The destocking continued through 2023, with volume declines running in the high single digits through the first 3 quarters. Full year 2023 adjusted earnings per share fell to $3.18 from $4.10 in 2022, a 22% decline. Adjusted EBITDA dropped from $1.21 billion to $1.11 billion, representing a margin of approximately 20%. The Liquibox acquisition provided incremental revenue that partially offset the organic declines, but it also added debt to an already leveraged balance sheet. The timing of the acquisition, closing in January 2023 just as the post-pandemic downturn was accelerating, raised questions about whether management had once again demonstrated poor M&A timing, echoing the Diversey experience of buying at the wrong point in the cycle. The inflation challenge compounded the demand softness. Petrochemical-based raw material costs, the primary input for polyethylene and other plastic films, had spiked during the pandemic supply chain crisis and remained volatile. Sealed Air's pricing power proved adequate to pass through cost increases to most customers, but the lag between cost increases and price realization compressed margins at precisely the wrong moment. On sustainability, the company made meaningful progress, but also confronted uncomfortable realities. By 2023, 52% of material weight sold was designed for recyclability, a meaningful achievement but well short of the 100% target originally set for 2025. The company quietly revised and extended those ambitious goals, acknowledging that the recycling infrastructure required to achieve full recyclability simply did not exist at scale. This was not unique to Sealed Air. Virtually every major packaging company that had made bold sustainability pledges in the late 2010s found itself revising targets as the gap between aspiration and infrastructure became clear. Under CEO Patrick Kivits in 2024, the company took the notable step of declaring itself substrate agnostic, increasingly offering fiber and paper-based packaging alternatives alongside traditional plastics. This was a significant strategic acknowledgement that the future of packaging might involve less of the petroleum-based materials that had been Sealed Air's foundation for 6 decades. For a company built on polyethylene film, the willingness to offer paper alternatives represented a meaningful philosophical shift, akin to a petroleum company investing in renewables. Whether this represented genuine strategic transformation or hedging remained an open question as the company entered its next dramatic chapter. In October 2023, with the post-pandemic hangover deepening and a new cost-cutting program targeting $140 to $160 million in annual savings freshly announced, the board of directors and CEO Ted Doheny mutually agreed to a leadership transition. Doheny departed immediately. The euphemism was familiar to anyone who follows corporate governance. The board had lost confidence in management's ability to navigate the post-pandemic downturn and position the company for long-term growth. The Reinvent C program had delivered real savings, but revenue growth remained elusive, and the stock had given back much of its post-Diversey divestiture gains. 2 interim co-CEOs, Emil Shamas and Dustin Seamock, the company's CFO, stepped in to manage the business while the board searched for a permanent replacement. The search landed on Patrick Kivits, a former president at WestRock, a major corrugated packaging company. Kivits was appointed CEO effective July 1, 2024, bringing experience in a related but different corner of the packaging world. He moved quickly, reorganizing the company into 2 market-focused divisions, food and protective, during the 4th quarter of 2024. Kivits described the reorganization as a critical foundational step, based on feedback from customers and investors who wanted clearer visibility into the economics of each business. The reorganization was significant because it created the structural prerequisite for a potential separation of the 2 businesses, something investors had been requesting for years. Then, in February 2025, Kivits departed after barely 7 months on the job. The company offered minimal explanation beyond the standard corporate language about leadership transitions. Dustin Seamock, who had served as interim co-CEO just months earlier, was appointed president and CEO, his second time running the company in under 2 years. For investors, the CEO carousel was becoming a governance red flag. 5 CEO transitions in under a decade, from Hickey to Parabir to Doheny to the co-CEOs to Kivits and back to Seamock, suggested either a board that could not select leaders or a company whose strategic challenges were too intractable for any single executive to solve. In the world of B2B industrial businesses, where customer relationships are built over years and strategic execution requires sustained consistency, this kind of leadership instability is particularly damaging. The leadership instability attracted exactly the kind of attention that boards dread. In November 2025, activist hedge fund Ancora Holdings began quietly pushing Sealed Air to sell itself, according to reporting by Semaphore. Ancora's thesis was straightforward. The company was strategically adrift, management turnover had eroded execution capability, and the best path to unlocking shareholder value was a sale to a well-capitalized private equity buyer who could make difficult portfolio decisions without the scrutiny of public markets. The board, whether motivated by Ancora's pressure, its own frustration with the CEO carousel, or a genuine belief that the company's next chapter was better written in private, initiated a strategic review process. The outcome was announced in November 2025. Sealed Air had agreed to be acquired by Clayton, Dubilier and Rice for $42.15 per share in an all-cash transaction, valuing the enterprise at $10.3 billion. The choice of buyer was laden with irony. CD&R was the same private equity firm that had owned Diversey before selling it to Sealed Air in 2011. Now, CD&R was buying the entire company, acquiring not just the packaging businesses, but whatever residual value the Diversey experience had created or destroyed within Sealed Air's organization. CD&R knew Sealed Air intimately, having sat across the negotiating table from the company a decade earlier, and presumably understood both the business's strengths and its strategic pathologies. One could argue that CD&R had profited twice from the Diversey saga, first by selling it to Sealed Air at a premium, and now by buying the entire company at a discount, influenced partly by the strategic confusion that the Diversey deal had caused. The deal offered a 41% premium to the unaffected stock price as of August 14, 2025, and a 24% premium to the 90-day volume-weighted average price as of November 12, 2025. These premiums reflected the degree to which the market had discounted Sealed Air's standalone prospects. The company conducted a 30-day go-shop period, soliciting interest from 22 private equity firms and 7 strategic parties. No superior proposal emerged, a telling indication that the packaging industry's strategic buyers did not see enough upside to outbid CD&R. The financing, a $7 billion debt package led by JP Morgan, Bank of America Securities, BNP Paribas, Goldman Sachs, UBS, and Wells Fargo, with additional participants including Citi, Mizuho, and RBC Capital Markets, was preparing to launch to credit markets as of early March 2026. To put the financial trajectory in context, Sealed Air reported full-year 2024 net sales of $5.39 billion, with adjusted EBITDA of $1.11 billion, and EBITDA margin of roughly 21%. Full-year 2025 showed essentially flat revenue at $5.4 billion, but with free cash flow of $459 million and net earnings improving to $441 million. The company's net debt stood at approximately $4 billion. At the acquisition price, CD&R was paying roughly 9.3 times trailing EBITDA, a reasonable multiple for a cash-generative industrial business, but one that assumes meaningful operational improvement to deliver private equity-grade returns. The transaction is expected to close by mid-2026, at which point Sealed Air will become a private company for the first time since its founding. Sealed Air's headquarters will remain in Charlotte, North Carolina. For a business that went public with $85,000 in 1960, the $10 billion exit represents an extraordinary, if circuitous, value creation story. For investors who held through the Diversey debacle, the CEO carousel, and the post-pandemic downturn, the acquisition price offers closure, if not the kind of premium that a better executed strategic plan might have commanded. The most important strategic shift in Sealed Air's recent history is one that most people outside the packaging industry have missed entirely. The company has systematically transformed itself from a materials manufacturer, a business that sells rolls of plastic film and sheets of bubble wrap, into a systems company that sells integrated equipment plus consumable solutions. Think of it as the packaging industry's version of the razor and blade model, and understanding how it works is essential to evaluating where the business goes from here. In the traditional packaging materials business, a customer orders rolls of shrink film or sheets of cushioning from any number of suppliers, feeds them into generic packaging equipment, and uses price as the primary purchasing criterion. Switching costs are minimal. A procurement manager can call 3 suppliers, compare prices, and switch with little operational disruption. This is commodity economics, and commodity economics are brutal for suppliers. The only lever available is to be the lowest cost producer. And in a global market with low barriers to entry, that is a race with no permanent winner. The systems model inverts this dynamic. Instead of selling materials alone, Sealed Air sells or places proprietary packaging equipment at a customer's facility. automated bagging machines under the AutoBag brand, vacuum packaging systems under CryoVac, right-sized cartoning systems, or bag-in-box dispensing units through Liquibox. Once the equipment is installed and integrated into the customer's production line, it requires compatible consumable materials, the specific film, bags, pouches, or trays designed to work with that particular machine. The customer does not buy generic materials from the cheapest supplier. They buy Sealed Air's proprietary consumables because that is what the installed equipment requires. This creates stickiness that pure material sales cannot match. To understand why, consider what actually happens when a major food processor or e-commerce fulfillment center installs a Sealed Air packaging system. The process begins months before the equipment arrives, with Sealed Air's application engineers conducting detailed assessments of the customer's products, packaging volumes, throughput requirements, quality standards, and existing production line layout. The equipment is then customized and configured for the specific application, installed by Sealed Air technicians, and integrated into the customer's production workflow. Operators are trained on the new system. Quality assurance protocols are established. The packaging specifications are dialed in through iterative testing until the system produces consistent, reliable results. Once operational, the system generates recurring consumable revenue for years, often for the life of the equipment. The customer cannot simply swap in a cheaper competitor's film or bags because the equipment is calibrated for Sealed Air's proprietary materials. Service contracts add another revenue layer and deepen the relationship. Software that optimizes packaging throughput and material usage creates yet another switching cost. By the time a customer has been running a Sealed Air system for 2 or 3 years, the total cost of switching, including downtime, re-engineering, retraining, requalification, and the risk of packaging failures during transition, far exceeds any potential savings from cheaper materials. The 2019 acquisition of Automated Packaging Systems was pivotal to this strategy because it brought the AutoBag brand, the market leader in pre-opened bag-on-a-roll automated packaging. AutoBag systems are used across fulfillment, food, medical, and industrial applications, and each machine is an annuity that generates ongoing demand for AutoBag-compatible bags. The Liquibox acquisition extended the same model to liquid packaging, where bag-in-box dispensing systems create similar consumable lock-in. The economics are compelling on both sides of the transaction. For customers, automated packaging systems reduce labor costs, the single largest expense in most fulfillment operations, improve consistency and throughput, and reduce material waste through right-sizing and optimization. In an era of chronic labor shortages in warehousing and food processing, the labor savings alone often justify the equipment investment within 12 to 18 months. For Sealed Air, the model generates higher margin recurring revenue with significantly greater visibility and predictability than spot material sales. It is the difference between running a gas station, where customers can drive to any competitor at any time, and running a car dealership with an exclusive service contract, where the customer relationship extends for years. The sales cycle, however, is long and technically complex. Placing a packaging system at a major customer requires detailed assessment of their products, volumes, throughput requirements, and existing infrastructure. Sealed Air's application engineers work alongside customer operations teams for months before a system goes live. This is not a catalog sale. It is a consultative, relationship-driven process that favors incumbents with deep industry knowledge and large installed bases over new entrants with lower prices. A startup with a cheaper machine faces an enormous credibility gap. Major food processors and e-commerce companies cannot afford packaging failures, and they will pay a premium for the reliability that comes from working with a proven vendor. The sustainability imperative adds another dimension to the business model. Customers increasingly require packaging that meets specific environmental standards, whether for regulatory compliance, corporate sustainability commitments, or consumer-facing brand positioning. A packaging system designed around recyclable materials, reduced plastic usage, or circular economy principles becomes even stickier because the customer has invested not just in equipment and materials, but in an entire sustainability narrative built around specific packaging specifications. Changing suppliers means not just a production line disruption, but potentially a sustainability reporting disruption. This business model evolution is also why the two-division reorganization into food and protective matters strategically. The food packaging systems, centered on cryovac, serve protein processors, grocery retailers, and food manufacturers with specialized vacuum packaging, modified atmosphere packaging, and case-ready solutions. Modified atmosphere packaging, for those unfamiliar, replaces the air inside a sealed package with a specific gas mixture, typically nitrogen and carbon dioxide, that slows bacterial growth and oxidation, keeping food fresh dramatically longer than conventional packaging. The protective packaging systems serve e-commerce fulfillment, electronics manufacturers, industrial shippers, and logistics companies. The equipment, the consumables, the engineering expertise, and the customer relationships are fundamentally different between these two worlds, even though both employ the same razor and blade economic architecture. Understanding Sealed Air's competitive position requires examining both the structural forces acting on the packaging industry and the company's specific advantages, or lack thereof, that determine whether those forces create value or destroy it. This analysis is particularly important in the context of the CD&R acquisition, because the playbook that private equity firms use to create value in industrial businesses, cost reduction, operational improvement, portfolio optimization, and financial engineering, works only to the extent that the underlying competitive dynamics support margin expansion and cash flow generation. The threat of new entrants in packaging is paradoxical. The basic materials business has low barriers to entry. Polyethylene film extrusion is well understood technology, and regional manufacturers can set up production with modest capital. But the systems business, where Sealed Air has increasingly concentrated, has much higher barriers. Building the engineering capability to design, manufacture, install, and service automated packaging equipment requires years of accumulated expertise, a trained sales and service force, and a track record of installations that gives customers confidence. A startup cannot credibly bid for a multi-million-dollar packaging system installation at a Tyson Foods plant or an Amazon fulfillment center. The brand reputation matters in ways that pure commodity businesses rarely experience. Supplier bargaining power is moderate. Sealed Air's primary raw materials are petrochemical-based resins, principally polyethylene and polypropylene, sourced from multiple global suppliers. No single supplier has meaningful leverage, and the company has historically been able to pass through raw material cost increases to customers, albeit with some lag. The sustainability shift toward recycled and bio-based materials could change this dynamic if the supply of recycled content becomes constrained. But for now, supplier power is not a significant competitive concern. Buyer bargaining power is the force that warrants the most attention. Sealed Air's largest customers include some of the most powerful procurement organizations in the world. Amazon, Walmart, Tyson Foods, and other major food processors and retailers have enormous leverage in negotiations and the sophistication to evaluate alternatives rigorously. Customer concentration risk is real. Losing a single large account can meaningfully impact segment revenue. However, the equipment-based model mitigates buyer power for installed-base customers, who face significant switching costs. Material-only customers have much less friction in switching and exert correspondingly greater pricing pressure. The threat of substitutes is the most complex force in Sealed Air's competitive environment. At the commodity end, substitution risk is high. Paper-based cushioning, molded fiber packaging, air pillows from cheaper manufacturers, and even reduced packaging through product design improvements all threaten traditional plastic protective packaging. The sustainability movement actively promotes substitution away from single-use plastics. But at the systems end, substitution risk is lower. A customer who is invested in an automated vacuum packaging system optimized for their specific product lines does not easily switch to an entirely different technology platform. Competitive rivalry is intense in materials, but more manageable in systems. In materials, Sealed Air competes against Amcor, which completed its acquisition of Berry Global in April 2025 to create a combined entity with approximately $24 billion in revenue, dwarfing Sealed Air's $5.4 billion. This is not just a scale difference, it is a qualitative shift in competitive dynamics. A company 4 times your size can invest more in R&D, negotiate better raw material prices, offer bundled solutions across a broader product range, and absorb price wars that would be existential for smaller competitors. Pregis, a private company focused squarely on protective packaging, is an aggressive direct competitor with strong automation capabilities and the freedom from public market scrutiny that allows it to invest aggressively for market share. Ranpak Holdings competes with paper-based alternatives that directly address the sustainability concerns, pushing customers away from plastic. Sonoco Products provides competition across multiple packaging categories. In the food packaging equipment space, Multivac is a formidable competitor in vacuum and thermoforming systems. The competitive landscape is, in short, crowded and getting more so. Turning to Hamilton Helmer's 7 Powers framework, which identifies the sources of durable competitive advantage, Sealed Air's position is real but contested. Scale economies are present but not decisive. Sealed Air benefits from manufacturing scale, distribution network density, and the ability to amortize R&D spending across large volumes. But the Amcor-Berry combination now dwarfs Sealed Air's scale, and regional competitors can achieve adequate scale in local markets. Scale is necessary for competitiveness, but insufficient for dominance. This is a critical distinction. In Helmer's framework, scale economies are a power only if a company has achieved a level of scale that competitors cannot practically match. In packaging, the minimum efficient scale is relatively modest compared to industries like semiconductors or aircraft manufacturing, which means that scale advantages, while real, are contestable. Switching costs are the company's strongest power. Equipment placements create genuine stickiness, particularly in food packaging, where cryovac systems are deeply integrated into customer production lines and where food safety certification requirements add regulatory switching costs on top of operational ones. In the food industry specifically, changing packaging suppliers can trigger revalidation requirements with food safety regulators and retail customers, a process that can take months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Material-only sales have lower switching costs, which is precisely why the company is strategically shifting toward the equipment model. Branding is moderate and operates differently across segments. Bubble Wrap has extraordinary consumer brand recognition, one of the few packaging brands that virtually every person on the planet can identify. But in B2B purchasing, brand awareness does not translate directly into pricing power. Procurement decisions are driven by performance, cost, and service quality. The Cryovac brand carries meaningful weight in the food processing industry, where it is associated with quality and reliability, but brand alone does not constitute a durable power in Helmer's framework. Process power, the accumulated expertise and institutional knowledge that enables superior execution, is moderate to strong. Sealed Air's application engineering capabilities, its ability to design custom packaging solutions for complex products, and its decades of manufacturing know-how represent real advantages that competitors cannot easily replicate. This is particularly true in food packaging, where regulatory requirements and food safety considerations add layers of complexity that favor experienced incumbents. Network effects do not apply to B2B packaging in any meaningful way. Unlike software platforms where each additional user makes the product more valuable for all users, there is no mechanism by which Sealed Air's product becomes more valuable to one customer because another customer is using it. This is a fundamental limitation of B2B industrial businesses versus technology businesses, and it is one reason why industrial companies rarely achieve the valuation multiples that software companies command. Counterpositioning, the ability to adopt a new business model that incumbents cannot copy without damaging their existing business, was historically present when bubble wrap was a novel innovation. In the 1960s and 1970s, traditional packaging material suppliers, invested in paper and cardboard infrastructure, were slow to adopt plastic air cushion technology because it cannibalized their existing product lines. Sealed Air benefited from this hesitancy, but that counter-positioning advantage has long since been competed away, as every major packaging company now offers plastic, paper, and hybrid solutions. Cornered resources are weak. Sealed Air does not possess unique access to raw materials, talent, or intellectual property that competitors cannot match. Sustainability innovation could theoretically become a cornered resource if the company develops proprietary recycling or bio-based material technologies that are difficult to replicate. But this remains aspirational rather than realized. The overall assessment is that Sealed Air has real but contested moats, strongest in equipment-based solutions where switching costs and process power create genuine stickiness, weakest in commodity materials where scale is necessary but insufficient, and where the Amcor-Berry combination has altered the competitive landscape dramatically. The Sealed Air story, spanning 7 decades of invention, reinvention, overreach, and correction, offers a remarkably rich set of lessons for operators and investors alike. Innovation commoditization is inevitable, and the only response is to keep climbing. The bubble wrap patent expiration taught Sealed Air a lesson that technology companies learn repeatedly. Any proprietary product will eventually face imitation and price competition. The response cannot be to defend the existing product fortress, it must be to climb the value chain, moving from selling materials to selling solutions, from selling products to selling outcomes. Sealed Air's shift from commodity film to integrated equipment plus consumables systems is the packaging industry's version of this imperative. The companies that thrive across decades are the ones that continuously reinvent the basis of competition before their current advantages expire. Financial engineering without operational excellence is a loaded gun. The 1989 leveraged recapitalization worked because it was paired with genuine operational transformation under a management team that understood both the opportunity and the risk. The debt was a catalyst, not a strategy. When the same logic, that leverage unlocks value, was applied more casually in subsequent transactions, including the debt-financed Diversey acquisition, the results were destructive. Leverage amplifies whatever is underneath it. Operational strength becomes stronger, but operational weakness becomes fatal. Investors should be deeply skeptical of managements that use balance sheet gymnastics as a substitute for competitive improvement. The conglomerate discount is real, and synergy is the most overused word in M&A. Diversey proved that diversification without genuine operational synergy destroys value. The cleaning chemicals business and the packaging materials business shared virtually no customers, no manufacturing processes, no sales channels, and no cultural affinity. The theoretical synergies around sustainability and food safety were too abstract to generate tangible financial returns. For investors evaluating acquisition-driven strategies, the critical question is always, does the combined entity create value that neither business could capture alone? If the answer requires a whiteboard and a consultant to explain, it probably does not. B2B moats require constant reinforcement. Equipment placements and customer relationships in industrial businesses take years to build and moments to lose. A single failed installation, a quality issue on a food packaging line, or a competitor's willingness to undercut on service can unravel a decade of relationship building. Sealed Air's strongest competitive positions are in accounts where it has deep engineering relationships and installed equipment, but maintaining those positions requires sustained investment in service, innovation, and talent. Companies that harvest their B2B moats without reinvesting eventually find them empty. Sustainability is becoming a strategic requirement, not a marketing choice. Sealed Air's sustainability journey, from bold pledges to quiet target revisions, to the strategic acknowledgement that the company must become substrate agnostic, reflects a broader truth. In packaging, the ability to offer environmentally responsible solutions is transitioning from a nice-to-have to a procurement requirement. Large customers are demanding it, regulators are mandating it, and consumers are expecting it. Companies that lead this transition genuinely, not performatively, can build competitive advantage. Companies that lag risk irrelevance. Sometimes the activists are right. Sealed Air's story is a case study in the value of external pressure as an organizational catalyst. When Ancora Holdings pushed for a sale in 2025, the company had cycled through 5 CEOs in under a decade without resolving its fundamental strategic questions. The board, left to its own devices, might have continued searching for the right leader indefinitely. The activist pressure created urgency that the board's own governance processes had failed to generate. For investors, this is a reminder that activism, while sometimes disruptive, can accelerate necessary changes that internal governance cannot. When to divest, admitting mistakes creates value. One of the hardest decisions in corporate strategy is acknowledging that an acquisition was a mistake and selling the business at a loss. The natural human tendency, amplified by executive ego and board dynamics, is to keep trying to make it work, to pursue one more year of integration, to believe the synergies are just around the corner. Harry Berry's willingness to sell Diversey at a $1.1 billion loss was painful, but correct. Every year the company held on to Diversey was a year of management distraction, suboptimal capital allocation, and strategic confusion. The lesson for investors is that the announcement of a divestiture at a loss can be a powerful buy signal, because it indicates management has the intellectual honesty and strategic clarity to prioritize future value creation over past mistake justification. In mature markets, capital allocation is the ball game. When organic growth is scarce and market expansion is limited, the difference between good and mediocre industrial companies comes down to how they allocate capital. Sealed Air's track record on capital allocation is mixed at best. The Cryovac acquisition was strategically sound. The Diversey acquisition was value destructive. The automated packaging systems acquisition was smart. And the Liquibox acquisition remains too early to judge. For investors in mature industrials, evaluating management's capital allocation discipline is more important than evaluating their growth strategies, because in these markets there is less room for error and less growth to bail out mistakes. With the CD&R acquisition expected to close by mid-2026, the traditional bull versus bear framework takes on a different complexion. For current shareholders, the investment question is largely binary. Will the deal close at $42.15 per share? And what is the risk of a failed transaction? But for those evaluating Sealed Air as a business, whether as potential private equity co-investors, credit investors in the $7 billion debt package, or simply students of industrial strategy, the fundamental analysis remains essential. The case for optimism rests on several structural advantages. E-commerce, despite its post-pandemic normalization, remains a long-term secular tailwind for protective packaging. Global e-commerce penetration continues to grow, and every online order requires some form of packaging protection. The shift to online grocery, accelerated by the pandemic, opens additional addressable market for both protective and food packaging solutions. Automation adoption in warehousing and food processing is accelerating, driven by labor cost inflation and chronic worker shortages that show no signs of abating. The equipment plus consumables model creates recurring revenue with meaningful switching costs, providing visibility and stability that pure materials businesses cannot match. Cryovac's dominance in protein packaging, where vacuum packaging and modified atmosphere systems extend shelf life and reduce food waste, addresses genuine sustainability concerns while generating attractive margins. The global protein market continues to expand as rising incomes in developing countries drive increased meat consumption, creating a structural growth driver for food packaging. And the potential to unlock value through a strategic separation of the food and protective businesses remains live under private ownership, where CD&R can execute portfolio decisions without the quarterly earnings scrutiny that paralyzed public management. The case for caution is equally substantive. Sealed Air operates in mature, low-growth markets where organic revenue expansion in the low single digits is the best-case scenario. The packaging industry is consolidating rapidly, and the Amcor-Berry combination has created a competitor with 4 times Sealed Air's revenue and correspondingly greater scale advantages in procurement, manufacturing, and R&D investment. Large customers like Amazon possess the procurement sophistication and scale to commoditize their packaging suppliers, And the ever-present threat that a major customer might backward integrate into packaging production creates structural pricing pressure. Amazon has already developed its own frustration-free packaging programs and increasingly dictates packaging specifications to its suppliers rather than deferring to their recommendations. The sustainability imperative, while offering opportunities for innovation, also threatens existing product lines. Every initiative to reduce packaging, to make packaging reusable rather than disposable, or to substitute paper for plastic, diminishes the addressable market for Sealed Air's core products. The management track record, including the Diversey disaster, the CEO carousel, and the repeated failure to achieve consistent organic growth, suggests organizational challenges that private ownership alone may not resolve. Competition from lower-cost regional players, particularly in Asia where labor and raw material costs are lower, creates additional pressure on margins in commodity segments. Economic sensitivity remains a concern. Packaging demand correlates with industrial production and consumer spending, making Sealed Air's revenue cyclical despite the perceived defensiveness of food packaging. The $7 billion of acquisition debt that CD&R is layering onto the business creates its own risk. If the economy softens meaningfully or raw material costs spike again, the debt service burden could constrain the very operational investments needed to drive margin improvement. History offers a sobering precedent. Sealed Air's own 1989 leveraged recapitalization worked, but it was a much smaller bet on a much simpler business. The CD&R transaction is orders of magnitude larger, and the business is orders of magnitude more complex. There is also the question of what comes next after CD&R. Private equity firms do not buy companies to hold them forever. They buy them to improve them and sell them, typically within 3 to 7 years, either through an IPO, a sale to a strategic buyer, or a secondary buyout by another PE firm. Each of these exit paths has different implications for employees, customers, and the long-term health of the business. The track record of PE ownership of industrial companies is mixed. Some emerge leaner and stronger, others emerge loaded with debt and stripped of the investment that sustains long-term competitiveness. The key metrics that matter most for tracking Sealed Air's ongoing performance under private ownership, and for evaluating the company if it eventually returns to public markets, are two. First, equipment placements and installed base growth. This is the leading indicator of future consumable revenue and the clearest measure of whether the equipment plus consumable strategy is working. A growing installed base means growing recurring revenue. A stagnant base means the business model transition is stalling. Think of each equipment placement as a seed planted that will produce a harvest of consumable revenue for years. The rate of new plantings determines the trajectory of the business. Second, adjusted EBITDA margin trajectory. In a mature, low-growth business, margin expansion is the primary lever for value creation. Sealed Air's adjusted EBITDA margins have hovered around 20 to 21% in recent years. CD&R's ability to drive margins toward 25% or above through cost rationalization, portfolio optimization, and the natural margin accretion of a growing equipment consumables mix will determine whether the acquisition generates attractive private equity returns. As the CD&R acquisition moves toward its expected mid-2026 closing, the most immediate question facing Sealed Air is what private ownership will mean for the company's strategic direction. The decision that public market investors debated for years, whether to split the food and protective packaging businesses into separate entities, becomes a question for CD&R's operating partners to answer. Private equity ownership eliminates the quarterly earnings pressure that constrained bold portfolio decisions, but it introduces its own imperatives. Leverage that must be serviced, a return timeline that demands results within 3 to 5 years, and an eventual exit, whether through IPO, strategic sale, or secondary buyout, that requires demonstrable value creation. The competitive landscape continues to shift beneath the company's feet. The Amcor-Berry combination, completed in April 2025, created a packaging colossus with approximately $24 billion in combined revenue, 4 times Sealed Air's scale. That kind of scale disparity affects everything from raw material purchasing power to R&D investment capacity to customer negotiating dynamics. CD&R will need to decide whether Sealed Air's path to competitiveness lies in further consolidation, acquiring complementary businesses to close the scale gap, or in doubling down on the equipment plus consumables niche, where scale matters less than specialization. New materials technologies, from mushroom-based packaging developed by companies like Ecovative to seaweed-derived films and molded fiber alternatives, are moving from laboratory curiosities toward commercial viability. These technologies threaten to disrupt the petrochemical-based materials that remain the foundation of Sealed Air's product portfolio. Robotics and artificial intelligence are transforming warehouse operations in ways that could either enhance or diminish the value of Sealed Air's packaging automation systems, depending on whether the company adapts its offerings to integrate with broader warehouse automation platforms or gets bypassed by more comprehensive robotic systems that handle packaging as just one step in a fully automated workflow. The sustainability race continues to intensify. Sealed Air's decision to become substrate agnostic, offering paper and fiber alternatives alongside traditional plastics, was a pragmatic acknowledgement that the market is moving away from single-use plastic packaging. Whether the company can lead this transition or merely follow it will depend on R&D investment, partnerships with material science innovators, and the willingness to cannibalize existing products in favor of more sustainable alternatives. The regulatory environment is tightening globally, with the European Union's packaging and packaging waste regulation imposing increasingly stringent recyclability and recycled content requirements, and similar legislation advancing in various U.S. states. Companies that can offer packaging solutions compliant with these evolving standards will have a meaningful competitive advantage over those scrambling to catch up. There is also the question of private equity interest in the broader packaging sector. The CD&R acquisition of Sealed Air is not occurring in isolation. Private equity has been highly active in packaging for years, drawn by the sector's cash-generative characteristics, essential product positioning, and opportunities for operational improvement. Apollo Global Management's ownership of Pregis, various PE-backed specialty packaging companies, and the broader trend of industrial consolidation all suggest that Sealed Air's transition to private ownership is part of a larger wave. Whether CD&R eventually re-IPOs the company, sells it to a strategic buyer like Amcor, or splits the food and protective businesses and exits each separately remains to be seen. What Mark Siobhan and Al Fielding started in a New Jersey garage in 1957, trying to make wallpaper out of two shower curtains, became an accidental invention that protected billions of dollars of fragile goods, fed a global food supply chain, survived near bankruptcy, endured a decade of strategic missteps, and ultimately attracted a $10 billion bid from one of the most sophisticated private equity firms in the world. The story of Sealed Air is not glamorous. It does not involve social media virality, software eating the world narratives, or founder mythology. It is a story about the unglamorous but essential work of moving things without breaking them and preserving food without spoiling it. It is a story about what happens when innovation meets commoditization, when financial engineering meets operational reality, and when the market finally runs out of patience with a company that cannot decide what it wants to be. CD&R presumably believes it knows the answer to that question. The next chapter will tell us whether they are right. 1. Sealed Air Corporation Annual Reports and SEC 10-K filings, 2010 to 2025, for financial details, strategic narrative, and risk factor disclosures. 2. Karen Ruck, Sealed Air Corporation's Leveraged Recapitalization, Harvard Business School Case Number 294 to 122, for detailed analysis of the 1989 financial engineering experiment. 3. Sealed Air Investor Relations press releases and earnings call transcripts, ir.sealedair.com, for quarterly financial performance and management commentary. 4. Packaging Dive coverage of Sealed Air CEO transitions, strategic reviews, and industry dynamics, packagingdive.com. 5. Semaphore reporting on Ancora Holdings' activist campaign and the CD&R acquisition process, November 2025. 6. Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice transaction announcements and financing details. CDR.com. 7. Smithers and Fredonia Group Industrial Packaging Market Reports for industry size, growth rates, and competitive landscape context. 8. Clayton Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, for the theoretical framework underlying innovation commoditization dynamics. 9. Bloomberg reporting on Sealed Air's $7 billion buyout debt launch preparation, March 2026. 10. Amcor-Berry Global merger filings and announcements for competitive landscape implications. This podcast is brought to you by Empor.top, the stories of top companies. Disclaimer: this AI-generated content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. If you like our podcasts, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And don't forget to follow us on X at Empor.top. Find thousands of stories of top companies on our website, Empor.top. Empor.top is brought to you by HeyFin.co. Fin is a personalized junior AI research assistant for equity portfolio managers. Check it out at HeyFin.co.